Let me tell you a little something about love, Dennis. It has voracious appetite. It eats everything. Friendship, family. It kills me how much it eats. But I'll tell you something else. You feed it right, and it can be a beautiful thing, and that's what we have. You know, when someone believes in you, man, you can do anything, any fucking thing in the entire universe. And when you believe right back in that someone, then watch out, world, because nobody can stop you. Then nobody, ever. And you feel this way about Lee? What? Fuck no. Talking about Christine, man. No shitter ever came between me and Christine. Now you watch this.
Welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we are never learning to drive after watching Christine. I'm Anna Bogutska, co-founder of the Final Girls Collective and your podcast host. If you're new to the show, welcome. A little recap. In real life, the Final Girls put on events and screenings that explore the intersections of horror film and feminism. We can do that again now. We did one the other day. And on the show, we take a horror trope and rip it apart, explore what works, what doesn't, how it's changed, what has aged badly, kind of just revisit horror films and discuss them in depth with some really smart, really funny women and non-binary folk. And in this fourth series of the podcast, we're looking at teen horror and why teenagers and their woes make some of the most compelling protagonists and villains in the genre space. We're going from the original slasher films of the 70s to the most recent teen horror movies. So we've got a lot to cover yet. But before we dive into our film this week, quick reminder, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Final Girls UK for updates, lists, event announcements, horror memes, a lot of TikToks of Ghostface dancing. We also have a Patreon where you can support our work, get occasional bonus episodes, and if you don't want to join that's fine. But we really would appreciate if you could leave us a little rating or a little review over on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people discover the show. But in this week's episodes, we're not looking at the start of a franchise, but at a one-off horror film. Christine. An adaptation of a Stephen King novel by the master of horror John Carpenter. On the surface, Christine is just about an evil car. And while the premise might sound silly, it contains multitudes. And upon rewatch, it is a truly chilling horror film, especially watching it now. You'll find out after hearing the episode exactly why I found it so chilling. If you're new to the show and have never seen Christine before, joining me on this episode is the film critic, Dr. Kelly Weston, my fellow King fan, one of the smartest people I know, and I guess after this episode, our official Stephen King correspondent. So with all of that said, please enjoy our take on Christine. So welcome back onto the podcast, Dr. Kelly Weston.
Thank you for having me back.
You are my official Stephen King correspondent. I think it is illegal for me to talk about a Stephen King adaptation without talking to you first.
First of all, I love that. It feels very, very true to my own feelings about Stephen King adaptations. I mean, we've talked about this before. Yes. It feels very natural for us. I feel like he's the third person, the dominant force in our relationship.
Yeah, it's like we have a book club with Stephen King, except Stephen doesn't know that he's in it.
Yeah. Exactly.
One day when we both have the time and the stamina to do it, we will talk about a lot of Stephen King adaptations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously, fully pulling for and hoping to guilt you into, because I'm now saying it publicly, doing an episode on Dolores Claiborne so that we can completely get into it. Is it horror? Not exactly, but it is a Stephen King adaptation, and we both love this film.
It is about the horror of being a woman.
It is.
It is.
I mean, some might say sometimes being a bitch is the only thing a woman has to hold on to.
Some might say indeed. Probably the best feminist line written by a male author ever.
I agree. I will give that to Stephen King. I mean, when I was 6 years old, my eyes were opened. He changed my life. It's like Stephen King and the rapper Trina are the two central forces in making me a feminist. So shout out to both of them. Shout out to Stephen King and Katrina Taylor.
Oh, I love it. And, we kind of digress about Stephen King, but it's not really a digression because we're here to talk about another Stephen King teen horror adaptation, Christine.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I love Christine. I'm pretty sure I saw Christine quite late. I'm pretty sure also around the time that we did the Stephen King panel, but just like by happenstance, because I like John Carpenter a lot, and it was one of those films of his that I hadn't seen, and I fell in love with it. So yeah, this is exciting for me.
So for anyone who has not seen Christine in a little while, could you try to briefly summarize the plot of the film?
I think it is a classic tale of boy meets car. Boy falls in love with car. Car destroys all the boys' human relationships. And I mean, it's about this nerdy guy called Arnie, who's played by Keith Gordon. Interesting connection. He's in a De Palma film, which was the last film that we talked about. No, it wasn't the last one we talked about, but it was the last Stephen King film we talked about, Carrie. De Palma also did, is it Dressed to Kill? Is that the one where it's like Michael Caine? Yeah, Keith Gordon is in that film. But anyway, he plays here this kid named Arnie, and basically he buys this car with a really sinister past and seems to ostensibly not quite be possessed by the car, but seems to sort of take on her influence, so that he adopts these really conventional masculine tendencies where he's like swearing all the time, and he's kind of full of swagger, and he also turns quite violent. I mean, he turns into actually his bully, who we will talk probably a little bit about later. But yeah, it's interesting that the car itself is, I mean, I want to get into this because this is kind of why I really want to talk about Christine. The car is this really gendered space, but Arnie becomes this really, ultra masculine to like macho person who's like, he becomes much more confident, but also a much darker version of himself. And interestingly enough, like sometimes I guess you expect in certain films that he will return to his original self, but they never able to return him to the sweet kid that he was before. He's completely overcome.
So before we get into Arnie in particular and his transformation, can you, when I sent you the list of films that I was going to cover in the teen horror series, you like screamed out for Christine, which I did. So can you tell me a little bit like why you wanted to talk about this film so badly?
Well, I think it's like, I thought it would be really fun because it's a really simple story, but also unexpectedly rich thematically. And it's got some excellent set pieces that I really want to get into, like the flaming car scene. And it's easily, I mean, like, it's definitely not the best Stephen King adaptation. It's not John Carpenter's best. It's not a perfect film. I think, there's a bit of a lull toward the end. Unfortunately, we have the lovely, iconic Harry Dean Stanton shows up, but he doesn't get a lot to do. No. I mean, I guess if you have a spate of murders, somebody has to investigate at some point, but he doesn't get,
he's a reassuring figure. He's there to reassure the panicked teenagers and kind of go a little bit like, oh shucks, there's been another murder. Well, someone's gonna die.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess he's, sort of true to form. He is law enforcement, but ultimately proves to be quite a hollow presence. But
Yes.
I also think, like, you talk about like teen horror there, and we'll get into this, but um we are right now obviously living in a very troubled era, but I
Living in a
think,
horror film. Mm-hmm.
yeah, exactly. But each generation, and thinking a lot about this film, it's sort of like linking troubled generations. And I think that, with each generation, you get more and more cynical, and each generation feels more and more displaced. And I think teen horror is able to really articulate that in a really interesting way. And I think this film does it in such a like beautiful, really elegant and like ornate fashion. We've talked about this just like right before we started recording, and we've had these conversations at length. Like, we're sort of living in an era where horror films seem to feel, or filmmakers of horror seem to feel, that you have to really bludgeon your audience with your political commentary. And it feels like it to me, it always feels like really gratuitous, because horror is innately political. It is instinctively political. This scaffolding is already there, and you don't need to sort of try so hard. And I have my reading of Christine as you do, and so we will talk about that. But the setup is there, and what makes this genre so fascinating is that you can watch these films and they're just really fun, but they also obviously sort of gesture to social anxieties and things that are, already like culturally bubbling up. And they have so much to say already about our community. So I mean, like, this is not a spoiler alert, but for me, my reading of Christina is very deeply linked to how, American culture is sort of inherently, sets the stage for these kind of toxicities like masculinity, and in particular racism. I think that's like a really undersung dimension of this film. So yeah, we will get into it, I think.
We'll get into it, but as you were speaking, I was thinking about, well, certain things that, I've said multiple times in different spaces, and it almost feels trite to say that horror has always been political, but it also seems to be consistently like a thing that press outlets really want to talk about. It's like, oh, has horror turned political? No, it always was. It's just that it's much more on the nose now. And even when it's done by competent or really great filmmakers, it does feel very on the nose now. Sometimes it does feel weirdly prescient because films are written like years before events happen, and sometimes they just align in a very weird kismety way, and then the conversation kind of starts, right, as if the film were kind of directly parroting something that happened 2 years after the film was actually made or written. But what I did really what I'm appreciating a lot, kind of going back to the original teen horrors of the 70s and now kind of in the 80s, even the really silly ones, is that you can and in Christine, despite not being the most famous or even the most beloved or even the most competently made of Carpenter films, there is so much commentary that is in the images, that is in the choices. And obviously this relates really back to Stephen King and kind of his themes that he keeps going back to in his stories over and over again. But the way that they're visualized, especially in the visuals as in this and in the soundtrack and the choice of the music, they say so much about the world and the expectations that are created by that world in the characters, especially in, the male characters. And obviously because of the nature of the conversations that we usually have on this podcast, we almost always focus on the female characters, or in this season in particular in teenage girls. But I really enjoyed rewatching this film because it's actually all about teenage boys and how fucked up they are. So
yes.
Can we talk about our two very opposed protagonists, Arnie and Dennis, who are kind of on the polar opposites of this high school hierarchy? You've got the weird, nerdy virgin nerd, and the kind of quite liked, plain but beloved quarterback. I think he's a quarterback, right? He's a football player.
Yeah.
So
I assume they're all quarterbacks.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the one position I know, to be honest. So I'm like, everyone's a quarterback. So what do you think about them, and like what bonds them, do you think? Because they're really, like, they're genuinely friends.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting question because it just hadn't occurred to me actually that, yeah, they are quite different. And another film, I think Dennis would probably be Arnie's bully.
Yeah.
Dennis is, you know, like you said, he's well liked. He's quite popular. Girls like him. We should say Kelly Preston pops up in this film and as this sort of, I think she's a cheerleader. Maybe she's not, but she's just kind of, you know, somebody who's pining after him and he doesn't really notice her.
Yeah.
But Arnie is the polar opposite. But the thing that struck me upon rewatch that really bonds them is misogyny. I mean, like, let's be real, that's a very powerful bonding force for a lot of men. When we first meet Dennis, you know, he's saying, like, you know, this is our senior year, like, it's time for you to get laid. This girl is a sperm bucket. You should try her. Like, she's really easy. And then you watch the film and it seems as though Arnie's more aggressive display of these traits caused Dennis almost to sort of shrink away from them. And so by the end of the film, you have Dennis being like much more thoughtful about women and about the main female character, Lee. Or, well, she's not the main female character, but she
very
is.
True.
She is.
She's not the title character. Do not disrespect Christine on the Christine episode.
I will try my best. I will try my best not to disrespect Christine. But yeah, so, you know, it's interesting that, you know, as far as we see, at least, because and the truth is that, you know, Dennis does risk his safety quite often for Arnie. So it's not as if they have this, like, really, you know, hollow emotional connection. But what seems to be the thing that they have in common is the way that they think about women as primarily objects.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and even Arnie, you know, the thing is, like, you know, Arnie is a nerd, but from the beginning, he too also shares these feelings about women, generally, you know?
Yeah. He is like quite aggressively misogynistic from the very start. He's very much like the nerds from Revenge of the Nerds. Like, women are a thing, like a status symbol. Like, he needs to lose his virginity. He literally needs to fuck any girl in order to you know, go to the next level of, I guess, being a man in his brain. But it has absolutely nothing to do with who the girl might be, what the girl might want. Doesn't even enter their mentality. The way that the dialogue in this film, especially at the start, was a lot. It was a lot. I was like, holy shit. Yeah. I mean, I knew the 80s were, like, not great for women, but fucking hell. She's got she looks really smart, but she's got the body of a slut. How does that even make sense?
Yeah, I don't know. What does it mean to look smart? I guess she's wearing, like, khakis. I don't know. I mean, how do you? I don't know, but yeah, it's quite, you know, it's really full on. Yeah. I was also quite taken aback by it, interestingly enough.
And, like, so aside from being bonded over misogyny, the other thing that I'm not sure if this took you aback as much as it took me as well, but perhaps because we're in a very masculine world, in the teenage boys world, but the bullying that Arnie experiences, you know, we talked a lot about bullying when we talked about Carrie, but here it takes on a kind of different dimension. It's very physical. It's very aggressive. They're literally trying to find ways to beat the shit out of him, and when they fight back against the bullies, they genuinely get physically hurt. Now, what do you make about the way that those like dynamics with the bullies are represented?
I mean, I was really surprised by it as well. I mean, obviously there's something really and not exclusively, but, you know, principally psychological about the bullying that we often see in teen girl films that is probably triggering on a different level because, you know, we lived through it and it feels quite personal, but this is also quite startling because I think it happens so quickly that when that character is called Buddy,
All
feels
bullies' names start with a B. It's like Biff,
Buddy.
Buddy,
Yeah.
Brad.
Yeah, exactly.
Brad. Yeah.
Right. But that he feels, as soon as he feels the least bit out of control or overpowered, that he pulls out a weapon. And he also seems to not be, the thing that is quite scary as well is that he feels emboldened to do it. Like, he doesn't feel like there is that there will be dire consequences, which does seem to suggest that this behavior is kind of acceptable on some level, that it is expected for him to sort of behave in a violent manner.
And you mentioned at the start when we were talking about Arnie is that, as you know, going forward a little bit, but as soon as Arnie meets Christine and kind of his transformation begins, you said that he kind of turns into his bully. Like, how does he transform after getting the car?
Well, and you know, you're right, because you say, you know, from the beginning Arnie is very misogynistic. So I think his core values actually don't really change that much. It's just the way that he presents himself. And so he, you know, wears sleeker, like better clothes. His clothes fit a little bit better. He has a bit of swagger. He seems like much more confident. And he is also much more emotionally detached, right? Like, before Christine, he at least has his one friendship with Dennis. Mm-hmm. But after Christine, he grows more and more distant from that emotional relationship. It'll be interesting to think about as well the, not the first victim, but the previous owner of Christine's, who, the man who sells him the car, mm-hmm. which I am pretty sure, and I'm not certain about this, but is the old guy from Home Alone. Which I didn't realize.
Don't let it be him, because he has the best worst line in the film, and I don't want to connect that line with Home Alone.
Oh, right. I know exactly which line you're talking about.
Yeah.
But
no.
But he, you know, he tells when Arnie and Dennis first buy the car, he tells them the story of his brother, and then later I think Dennis goes back to him and he reveals that actually the brother's wife and daughter had died in the car, and that the owner, his brother, wouldn't get rid of the car. Mm-hmm. Like, he had to be forced to get rid of it. And so it's interesting how Christine also begins to sort of proceed, I guess, the other women in their lives, but also really cuts off these emotional relationships. Like, she sort of intervenes in them, mm-hmm. like really makes them sort of, and given the car's implications and how it represents a kind of idealized American masculinity specifically, that, you know, she sort of embodies this, and that the characters who are possessed by her, mm-hmm. the characters who she is owned by, then sort of lose their capacity for compassion for mm-hmm. anybody but her.
Well, it's interesting because, like, we can talk about it as like a possession by Christine, or we can talk about mm-hmm. it as sort of the characters actually becoming their truest selves through the influence of mm-hmm. Christine. So like you were saying, Arnie is already kind of a misogynist and kind of a dickhead. Like, he's not presented as someone who is nice. He's presented as someone who is cowardly. And he's told, like, this is your position in society. You're a nerd, you're meek, you're not, you know, tall and handsome and appealing to women. You're not a powerful figure physically, meaning you're less than a man. And this car kind of slowly makes him shed, the influence of Christine makes him shed kind of these preoccupations and kind of transform into the other thing we'll talk about later on is kind of that he transformed into an old-fashioned version of a masculine ideal, like a 1950s version of that, a 1950s mm-hmm. American version, because this is mm-hmm. the story of Christine is kind of set in two times. It's like set in the 1950s and in 1978, and a lot of that is communicated visually and musically. So through the musical cues, the songs that Christine picks, not anyone else, and like these 70s teenagers who were, you know, Arnie specifically being influenced to become like a 1950s bully or a 1950s cool guy as well, because perhaps mm-hmm. you know, 20 years ago, even in that same town, he would have been the coolest dude in town, but he those kind of values have kind of gone extinct. But even rewatching it now in 2021, I was looking at it and thinking, it's like, actually, that's not too far off from the sort of conversations that can be found on incel boards. And in all of the conversations that we've had about, is the Joker, not to bring that disgusting film into this. Disgusting because it's mediocre, not because it's, damaging. Like, are these films talking about, are there, what's the word I'm looking for? How-to guides for incels, all these things. Incels, for anyone who doesn't know, are like specifically men on the internet who call themselves like involuntarily celibate and blame basically that on women and egg each other on into this frenzied state of misogyny that then has sometimes unfortunately become real life violence. And I was watching this film and feel like, fuck, the way that people start getting actually terrified of Arnie, people including his parents as well as his peers, his girlfriend Lee, his friend Dennis, actually start getting scared of him, because even though he might not be the most physically powerful person, the fact that all of these layers of kind of covering up, of social covering up that had been around him were peeled away by the influence of Christine kind of reveals someone really, really, really scary, because Arnie doesn't give a shit about anyone. He has things that he wants, and those are the things that he's gonna get, or doesn't really care who gets hurt if he's protecting Christine, and that's it. He doesn't even care about his own well-being.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I wanted to sort of, backtrack to something that you said earlier that was quite interesting, which is like the way that, his sort of 50s attire like really emerges in this era. I think it's a good place to sort of turn to, what's happening like currently in 1970s. It's 1978, right?
Yes, it's set in 78.
And yeah, because you brought up like a lot of interesting points. We were talking about like American masculinity specifically. The way that Arnie sort of like begins to embody 50s culture is like so really emblematic of how teen horror works. Generally one of the more dominant themes in teen horror is this kind of generational tension and this sort of feeling of alienation and displacement from your parents.
Yeah, like my parents don't get me, and something violent happens and they cannot help me. The teenagers are always out for themselves.
Exactly. And the 70s, I think, is like a particularly, tumultuous time in the States. And this film is actually released only like a few years later, 1983. But the 70s we're dealing with like the Vietnam War, and then its aftermath, and then hippies and the anti-war movement.
And also I also want to like bring out, I think I've mentioned it a couple times in previous episodes, the fact that as the hippie movement kind of was coming to an end, people always point to the Manson murders as the end of the hippie era.
Absolutely.
But I want to expand that into like in the 70s, there was more active serial killers in the United States of America than at any other point in time. So
1000%.
So the fact that people were aware and terrified of other people just like them who were like going out and murdering people, that those became national panics.
Well, but think about this, because I read this and it was like quite interesting to me. One of the major things that but like I think investigators, I can't remember where I read this article, but like the major thing that like John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer had in common were that they were born during wartime. And the BTK killer, like his father was this like, with this war, the returning war veteran who had PTSD. I mean, think about like what the 50s represented, this sort of like the imagery that comes out of the 50s is this really popularly like quite conservative, like very strict gender norms of like what the family is like. And we think about how fathers were generally expected to just like go to work and then come back home and not really contribute in any meaningful way to their children's lives, and just how remote and disconnected they were. The family was not the family that we think of now, the way we think of family now, and the sort of the intimacy that we really expect from our home environments. And it's really interesting how teen horror like maps out those connections. This sort of like, you know, really like a kind of you know, this conflict between what how culturally, I suppose, or communally we think of the family, and how that has sort of changed as the years go on and on. Because generally, like, you know, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So there's, as you were talking, it was like you made me think of something, and I wonder if this is the point that you're trying to get to as well. It's like in the horror of the 1970s, you know, the stuff. This is 1983, so like I'm kind of putting in the same wave, and obviously Carpenter, next to Deborah Hill, kind of created one of the blueprints for teen horror with Halloween. But
absolutely,
but in these films, especially in this era of late 70s, mid 80s, we see actually the change of who's a source of fear because of this. It's not the parents, the strict patriarch or the kind of oppressive mother who are the sources of fear. It's the teenagers themselves. And then there's a scene in Christine where Arnie's having dinner with his parents, and his parents, both of them, are like quite visibly scared of him. Like they're tiptoeing, they're walking on eggshells around what they might say, what they might ask of him. And I found it very curious that like usually in teen horror movies, parents are quite absent and it's just the teenagers by themselves, which is everything you were mentioning about like that distance, that generational dissonance. But I think there's also a thing that was happening at that time, perhaps changed quite significantly, that families started being afraid of their own children. I'm not saying this was the norm, but this became a possibility, especially as we were talking about real life serial killers who were all kind of from the same generation.
Right. And I think, you know, within that absence throughout teen horror, I think parents are almost always complicit in some way in the horror that ends up troubling and or haunting their children. I think about like, you know, Nightmare on Elm Street, where it's like the parents, you know, that's a film that's also quite obviously about childhood sexual abuse.
Yeah.
And the way that the parents handle it is by removing who they perceive as the villain, but then proceeding to not really like try to, you know, forge any sort of connections with their children after the fact. Parents are either, you know, not there, they're really remote, or they're sort of actively harming their children in some way. You also, like, this is apparent in Texas Chainsaw Massacre as well, which is obviously, like, you know, there are multiple theories about how it's like deeply connected to the Vietnam War and how children are sort of like offered up as like sacrificial lambs. And so even though in this film, I think parents grow to be like really afraid, well, his parents, Arnie's parents specifically, grow to be really afraid of him, there is still like a level of complicity, right? Because his parents have like a really vested interest in keeping him small and innocent. And, you know, they're kind of like nagging him. They're kind of always scolding him. His mother doesn't want him to use the word fellatio or any sort of obscenities. And the kind of person that he grows into is somebody who's always swearing and who is violent to his father. But, you know, they also, it's very weird. They don't want him to have a car. And a car is actually like, in American society, and we should say it, the American city is only livable through, apart from like New York, right, is only livable through car ownership. And so it is this rite of passage, this like sort of necessary pathway to independence for children. And the fact that they don't want him to have a car, even though he's already bought it and it's quite old anyway, so you don't imagine that he's going to, you know, before they know that Christine has, you know, supernatural tendencies, they don't want him to have the car. So they really they take great strides in order to sort of curb his independence. And it seems that they're like very interested in keeping him dependent on them. You know, it's very, Arnie is like a senior, right? And his mother is still sort of packing his lunch. So they do have, you know, even though they are afraid of him, they do have a role to play in the way that he turns out.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, as all parents do in the way we all turn out. But I realized that we've been speaking for a while without actually kind of really talking about Christine. So
the girl.
let's talk about the real protagonist of the film, the real villain, the lady in red.
I mean, you know, we Christine, she's the only red car, I think, in an assembly line of beige cars. So she's the color of blood. And she maims this guy, like with it, like as soon as she's built, she maims this guy who like reaches under her hood. And then another guy sort of.
Is she just slapping away some dude who was trying to get a little bit too frisky? Can we read it as that?
I mean, absolutely. We almost always see Christine is, especially because later on, Christine is sort of violently attacked by a group of boys. You know, she has very strong boundaries, Christine. And so, you know, that guy gets maimed, and then another guy takes his smoke break in the car and happens to drop ash on her seat. And she does not take kindly to that, and that man suffocates. And, you know, as I said, like, we learn that so it seems that she's kind of born bad, but then we later learn from the possible Home Alone guy that, I'm sorry. But we learned that it's possible that, you know, she can get attached to certain people, mainly her male owners. I think also this is like a good time to really like break down the implications of the car. Yes. Because this is kind of in part why I really wanted to talk about this film. The car is in large part, thanks to cinema herself, a symbol of, you know, sex and danger and freedom. But it's also a deeply gendered, and I would also argue, that's much less talked about, a deeply racialized space. So it's interesting that, you know, Christine is born in the 50s, and a lot of 1950s films sort of present the car as a space of dating and sex, and this is in part why parents are so threatened by the car, because it's a place where your kids can go off and have sex.
And also, let's just say that kind of image of the car is also very, very specific to American culture, and one that, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, has actually been created basically by American films. So it's a question of like, American films have created this image, and then that has actually created social behaviors. And
absolutely,
the drive-in is an all-American thing that has now been imported and, you know, exported all around the world, especially during the Panini times when cinemas weren't allowed to be open. But like that, you're absolutely correct. Like, that is a thing that symbolizes not just America, but American cinema and American teenagers in particular.
Absolutely. Car culture has been hugely influential in shaping gender and in teen culture, because it offers kids an escape from their parents. But we should also say that, you know, not only do cars hold this sort of very significant place in homosocial relationships, but that cars were also, you know, hugely, like, very central to keeping white people insulated from having to be publicly associated with other races. I mean, I read something like in my research for this where it was like there was huge anxiety around having white women share trains with black men on their way to work. And I mean, like, you think of like a horrible event like the Scottsboro case, where I think it's like the 1920s or 1930s, where this group of black boys and teenagers were accused with like absolutely no evidence, you know, of raping two white women on a train, and they were convicted. I mean, I have to like bring this stuff up because when we sort of connect or make these historical connections between things that are sort of common in our society and racism, people are kind of like, ugh, like rolling their eyes, like, really? And it's like, yes, really. A lot of the things
you're absolutely correct in bringing them up. Like, we're living in a post-you're wrong about world. Like, we are actually, it's our duty to make these connections, because they do inform decisions, and they do inform real, like, culture and art and things like that. They're all interconnected with one another. The thing is that we forget about these things the further away in the past that they are from us, or the further away in cultures that they are from us.
Absolutely. And I think also about like white flight to the suburbs, right? You need a car to get back and forth. And part of what racism and really any sort of marginalization does is regulate the spaces that the marginalized can exist in. It places limits on where you can go and your movement. And you're thinking about, like, you know, please forget that awful film, The Green Book. But The Green Book was a very real thing because Black people had to be very careful about which spaces they existed in because harm could come to them. We're seeing this also again now in, like, you know, the way people are treating trans people and trying to regulate the spaces where they can exist.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, this is huge. Like, this is why I kind of, like, really love this film, is because it's, like, the car becomes a really excellent representation of this, like, movement that is both first privileged but also gendered and also deeply racialized. I mean, like, it's also very interesting because Christine is born in the 50s and she represents this kind of, you know, her regenerative powers, which I guess we'll get into, seem to suggest that, you know, this unresolved horror that is behind us will keep rejuvenating itself and will keep recycling itself and will continue to be reborn throughout the eras, because, you know, I guess Lee and Dennis sort of, like, what's that thing they do? They, like, smash her. I don't know anything about cars despite driving.
Oh, you mean when they compress her?
Yes, exactly. They compress it and make it small, and it's very emblematic of sort of rewriting or trying to sort of disavow certain historical traumas. But every time I say traumas now, I think of that compilation of Jamie Lee Curtis saying it's about trauma. Halloween. We love her. We stand.
Do not. Just
but,
do not.
You know, it's true. It is true. You know, we're not getting to the heart of the problem. The thing itself exists. And you'd asked one of your questions that you'd sent to me was, like, you know, not to show how the pudding is made to the people listening. But one of your questions was, like, what kind of, you know, like, monster do you think of Christine as? And so maybe it's a good place here to sort of think, like, you know, in my head, I thought of her as, like, a kind of succubus where all of these, like, gendered and racialized things are sort of collapsed into her.
So the thing that's really interesting, I think there's a good point to talk about Christine as a monster, Christina and Christine's powers as well, and also a little bit about the difference between the origins of her powers, because, you know, we're not going to go into, like, the novel versus the film, because I've read so much Stephen King as a teenager. A lot of it just kind of blurs into one sometimes. So I think I might have read Christine as a teen, but not in any way that I can actually talk about it right now. But I do know that, like, in the novel, there is, like, a clear explanation that she's possessed by the spirit of one of her previous owners. So, like, actually there's an evil man who is inside the car, basically. But
interesting.
The filmmakers made the choice to make it kind of, you know, refuse that explanation and just make it an evil car. So they never really explain it. And whenever nothing, like, the source of evil is not telegraphed to us by the film, I always love it so much more, because essentially it makes it... you can project anything. You can read so many things into it, and it's not. I mean, it's very common for Carpenter's films as well. You know, even if you think of Michael Myers in the original Halloween, like, he's just a bottomless, shapeless, faceless pit of despair and evil. There is no real explanation for him until way down the line. And
who also keeps regenerating. Yeah,
for sure. And also, like, even in The Fog, I think, or, like, even in some of his lesser films that are a bit more, I mean, that I love dearly, but something like, you know, The Prince of Darkness or even The Thing, like, a lot of these things are very amorphous. So the fact that Christine is supernatural but not explain where that comes from, I really love, because a lot of it comes from readings of her, from all these other things. The fact that she is this beautiful car, but she's very much a product of the 50s. The fact that she's gendered, even by her name. The fact that she kind of starts behaving almost like a jealous lover. First as a protective lover, then as a jealous lover. Is she also kind of behaving like Arnie's mother in a way, where she's trying to protect him from bad influences, especially girls?
Well, I don't know, because let's be careful here, because another question that you asked me was, is a particular scene a sex scene? Which was very, you know, I have come across this theory before. I would love you to walk me through it, because my feeling is that the scene before, and we should say there's a part of Christine where Arnie's bully and his friends
Mhm.
sort of destroy Christine, and one of them like defecates on her, and that to me is quite clearly a rape scene. And the scene that comes later is Arnie sort of saying to her, "Show me," and she shows him her powers, the full breadth of her powers.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with both of them. If we interpret the show me scene as a sex scene, then I think the scene where Christine gets brutalized by the bullies is a rape scene. And I think that's a rating. I don't think that's one rating, but I think there is, perhaps because I'm still thinking about Titan. I am I am just thinking about like this intense attraction that Arnie feels, and I think Keith Gordon does play him as being kind of sexually attracted to the car, or
for sure
the power that the car gives him, or the self-confidence that Christine imbues him with, like the mix of all those things, the way she makes him feel, the way that people look at him when he's driving her, like all of these things mixed together, there is a definite, I think, sexual edge to the way that he plays it, which makes me think of those scenes as sexualized.
Right, and his actual girlfriend Lee, he feels like their relationship is like almost purely aesthetic and superficial.
Yeah,
like it's completely superficial. She is the prettiest girl in school, as we said. She looks smart. No, it's that. Yeah, she looks smart.
She looks smart, but wait, I actually wrote it down. She looks smart, but she's got the body of a slut.
Right. Okay. Some people's dream girl, I guess. But, it's very interesting because cars and women are quite twinned in a way, in that they're both these really primal, the foremost, putting this in quotes, possessions,
status symbols,
manhood. Yeah, they are extensions of, and specifically American manhood.
Mm-hmm.
And in any other scenario, Christine, Christine and Lee would be in the same space, or they would occupy much the same space. But it's clear that Arnie at least has a much more intimate relationship with Christine. He at least has like compassion for her in a way that he doesn't really have for Lee, who remains for most of the film, if not entirely for him, an object.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite interesting that, the film, and I think Titan, or however it is, I'm not French, but it is another film that is sort of like thinking about these really historical, traditional implications of the car, and how gender is sort of mapped onto the car. I mean, the very act of naming the car a female, as female, or giving her a female name, is part of, sort of patriarchal conception. So those things are like really well done, I think, in this film.
But I'm sorry, we kind of digressed. What do you think about Christine as a supernatural villain? I guess that's the most succinct way to describe her.
Well, I think that Christine is probably like, because you're right, you don't have a lot of context for her in the film anyway. We love to see a Stephen King film that does not immediately fall back onto an Indian burial ground. Although Christine does work, I think, in much the same way, in that she sort of embodies, I would argue that she embodies a kind of cultural horror. I would say that she, obviously she, like we're saying, she's sort of an idealized representation of American masculinity, because this is what she sort of this is what she extends to Arnie. But she also sort of like, I mean, to me, she's a kind of succubus, right? Like, she really does begin to sort of, as much as she possesses these men, she also begins to like really take from them, sort of like I guess draw them away from all, one of the things I was saying before was like, she really breaks off their emotional attachments so that these men become completely consumed with her. And so I think it's very interesting that, like, to place this sort of inanimate, she is an inanimate object, and we don't really see her as I suppose traditionally feminine, but she sort of possesses all of the traits of or conventional traits of like female monstrosity, as it is sort of transcribed in horror.
And one thing that kind of you mentioned earlier that you wanted to talk about, and I think this is a good place to bring it up, is actually that monstrosity, that violence, like the horror set pieces of Christine. What do you make of them, especially considering that Carpenter has gone on record saying that he doesn't really think of this as a horror film?
I mean, John, allow us. We will decide. I mean, it's interesting that he doesn't think of it as a horror because, I was watching Halloween because it was recently Halloween. And so, as I do, and Christine has a lot of the same stalking tendencies as one Michael Myers.
Yeah, she does. She loves to hide behind a bush.
Right, exactly. So it's kind of hard. It's interesting that he doesn't think of this as a horror because she really sort of the way that she, I suppose we get to know much more about her than we know about Michael. I mean, in
the first
films,
one,
by this point, by this point in the Halloween franchise, but she stalks her victims. She kind of toys with them as well, which is extremely insidious. My favorite set piece is, I mean, quite obvious probably, but the scene in which she chases, after she has been attacked by them, she chases the bullies down one by one, and she finds two of them near a fueling station. She drives into the fueling station and the car is, set ablaze, and then the guy, Buddy, sort of runs out down to the on the open road. It's absolutely completely pitch dark, by the way.
Yes.
And so you have this car that's on flames sort of driving down the road. John Carpenter, and I think he did the score time around with Alan Horowitz.
Yeah.
And so you have this like brilliant, like really classic score at this point. Sort of like, sort of just going like dun 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 as he sort of tracks him down the road, and it's incredible, and he's obviously he's not going to outrun the car, but it's just like a really this feels cliche to say at this point, like quite visually stunning. Like there's something about this
so
scene that
beautiful
always sticks out of my head.
I was really kind of taken aback. I think I was watching it in the dark, and I was like, holy shit, this is so gorgeous to watch. Like I kind of want the film just to be the car chasing this guy down the road for the entire 2 hours of it.
Yeah, and I think, again, to John Carpenter saying this film isn't a horror film, there are so many murders. There are, like, people just get into the car, and, at a certain point, you also realize, like, Christine is quite menacing, right? Like, I mean, from the beginning, you know that she's menacing, but you also know that she doesn't like particular things, and so there's this scene where Dennis is sort of, like, pulling on her handle, right? Like, putting on the car door. And you already begin to sort of develop this sense of dread when anybody other than Army attempts to go near Christine. I mean, John Carpenter is kind of like the master of this, right? He is, first of all, like hugely influential in sort of developing or pioneering the teen horror genre.
Absolutely.
But also in sort of mapping out suspense and sort of building, really like layering in a very like subtle way this sense of impending dread, so
Absolutely.
that you're sort of conditioned to know like this is like not gonna work out well for you.
He does this in really subtle ways that kind of make you identify with not necessarily the victim, but I think with the point of view of the villain. So there's so many shots in Halloween that make you feel afraid for the victim, but because you are seeing what Michael Myers is seeing, so you're very much all those POV shots, but the way that the rest of the film is crafted and the music and kind of all those different elements coming together with Carpenter always makes you feel the dread. I kind of think that his the actual kills sometimes aren't as impressive as the build up, because he's so good at kind of making you feel exactly the things that will set off the killer, or that will make them retreat and kind of wait for the next opportune moment to strike. And in Christine, I think one of my favorite not quite kills, because she doesn't kill Lee, is when Lee is eating a burger in the car. And as soon as she started unwrapping that burger, I was like, holy shit, Christine's not gonna like this. If like a single little drop of mayonnaise drops anywhere near the leather, she is gonna like, something's gonna happen. Like that dread of like, you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing. Like you should not be doing this in front of Christine. In Christine. Like, no.
How dare you, Lee? Not you eating in the car in Christine.
And the extent
on Christine's seat.
And Christine's like powers are weirdly not explained but completely believable, because even in that scene, she makes Lee choke on her burger. That's not a physical thing that she kind of has. She's not chasing her down the street. She's not compressing her inside the car. She's literally making her choke on something that she's eating. And I found that very scary. It's like those little hints at supernatural powers that are never really quite defined.
Yeah.
And I did kind of, we've spoken about our other book club member, Mr. King, a little bit, but I do find it interesting that this kind of also falls inside one of the first waves of King adaptations. I'd argue that we're probably living through the third, potentially fourth wave, because there was another big one in the 90s. But in the 80s, we got Carrie in 76, we got The Shining a few years earlier, we've got the Salem's Lot TV series, we've got Creepshow, got the Dead Zone. How do you think Christine kind of stands in this first wave of Stephen King visual adaptations?
And we should also say this is the third Stephen King adaptation of that year alone.
Yeah.
So he was,
on fire.
Bank.
Well done.
Good for him. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because he always he's so prolific, and I think there is a kind of sense that Stephen King is not like literature, but
incorrect.
And another set, I'm not subscribing to that belief. No. But in the other sense, his films, or his books, sorry, I should say, his books have gotten directors like Cronenberg, De Palma. Who's the other one? Kubrick. How dare I? Kubrick.
Oh my God, Kelly, the film birds are gonna come for you. Don't.
Well, they'll find me. It's fine. But these are like serious directors, right? Who have, I guess, like varying degrees of, at this point or these points in their careers, like have achieved varying degrees of status. But, they seem to find in his work something like really rich. I mean, all of the films that we've named, right, are these directors absolutely relishing what his material allows them to do, and like really using like a lot of fascinating stylistic flourishes to sort of like achieve it. I mean, we need not mention the brilliance of The Shining and its long legacy.
We've spoken at length about Carrie and how great that is.
Absolutely.
I mean, Creepshow.
Right, like these. I mean, also Cujo. I was in New York recently, and my uncle was watching Cujo, and I like had to stop to sort of like look at it, because it's a film about like a rabid dog, but somehow just like incredibly really well done. Like, these are not bad films. In terms of like how they sort of add to his I guess his legacy, right? Like, Christine is one of these films that, like, I think at the time was maybe moderately successful, but has since become a kind of cult classic for a lot of the reasons that we're talking about now. And so I think it's just sort of, part of his capacity to sort of set up like really kind of, I mean, when you hear about them, they sound quite silly, right? Like, oh, it's a dog chasing after these people, or it's a car who has supernatural powers. And yet these are really long, like really enduring films that continue to sort of like inspire filmmakers, right? So yeah, I don't know if I exactly answered your question, but I think it's sort of like, a part, like, it's the beginning of like a really rich legacy, right? Like, really indicative of his prowess, I guess, in horror.
Yeah, I think Christine, like, it was a good success at the box office, but critics really dismissed it at that time. I mean, to be honest, yeah, like I roll here, but critics always dismiss a lot of things that are great at the time of release. We all know the reasons why, but it is like, it is interesting that it wasn't really taken seriously, and I think the fact that King's literature wasn't taken seriously for a long time is a part of it. The fact that it's kind of just seen as cheap entertainment. But as we've been talking for about an hour, and as there's so much more that we could talk about, where there are so many different interpretations and layers and value to this film, and I think it is a horror film. I think it's very unsettling and creepy. It's creepy because the horror comes from the characters. Not so much because of the premise. Like, the premise of an evil car sounds dumb on paper, but Arnie is actually the really, really scary person in this. His bullies are scary in a completely different way. The entirety of the school and how, the teenage boys talk about the girls is really, really scary. His relationship with his parents is terrifying. Like, there's so many things about it that even watching it now, it's a film from the 80s that's set in the 70s, that takes a lot from 1950s Americana culture, and still it has elements that are really destabilizing and really creepy even now. Like, I can't remember why. Perhaps it was like from one of our conversations why this ended up in the teen horror list. I'm really glad it did, because it actually shows how some of the horror in Christine, the teen horror of Christine, comes from the teens themselves. It's not really from the car.
Absolutely. And you mentioned like a really fascinating thing, right? Like, he's always been quite good at this, and like we said, horror is always like a really particularly adept at articulating social horrors, and King is quite good at sort of misdirecting you. Like, obviously there's a lot of supernatural stuff going on, but almost always the people are the most monstrous and grotesque characters. But this also might be like, a really good place to talk about the music in Christine, because I mean, because this is the other thing, right? Like, I just sort of kind of, and he does get on my nerves when he does this shit. Like, I hate Indian Burial Grounds, right? But he's also, I think, quite perceptive and in a really interesting way about the kind of like rot of America. And so the Indian Burial Ground is kind of like, obviously, it's not necessary, but like it's something that it's his way, I think, of sort of translating that element. And the way that Christine, I mean, first of all, we should say Christine is born in, and this, I noticed this only upon this latest rewatch, was that Christine is born in Detroit. And Detroit is the home of Motown. So, I mean, for those, I guess, maybe children who are listening to this and don't know what Motown is the record company that's responsible for Michael Jackson, for Diana Ross, Smokey Robinson. And this is like, this music is considered the like American music, right? But Christine quite often, and I guess we should say, she tends to communicate through her
song choices,
the songs that she plays. It's interesting that she plays a lot of, shall we say, like traditional rock music, which is to say a lot of whitewashed Black music. And I don't know, because this sort of struck me this time around, like in 1983. I don't know how accepted it would have been to sort of say that rock music is Black music, but certainly it's widely accepted now that rock is born out of gospel and jazz and rhythm and blues, and this music is not just linked to by the Black artists singing them, but by a specifically Black experience of their country. So you have like the song that opens the film, and it kind of becomes like her theme music.
Bad to the Bone.
Bad to the Bone. It samples Muddy Waters, who's this American blues singer.
Yeah.
Then she, the Black artists that she does play are like Little Richard and Larry Williams. Little Richard, by the way, is like considered at this point, it is true, the pioneer of rock and roll as we know it. And it's like him, Chuck Berry, Sister Rosetta Sharp, Tina Turner. There is no rock music. There is no rock and roll without these people.
Absolutely.
And it is deeply interesting that her first kill is a black man. He is the guy who gets into the car and smokes his cigar and gets ash on her. Now, Christine may or may not see color. I don't know if she's obviously not confined by race, right? But I think that is such an interesting and really subtle way to sort of communicate this kind of Americana that we're talking about, right? Like this sort of cultural, just all these really interesting implications sort of are embodied by her. And when we're talking about like the way that horror now seems, very invested in telegraphing its, commentary and the kind of discourse that it wants to create. I love that the way that this is handled so subtly, right? Like this is like a very real like dimension of what this film is about, but it's not, sort of overtly, it's not done in such a way that it's like shoving your face in, you know what I mean? Because I think we are sort of like in this era now where it would be, if Christine was made in 2021, and heaven forbid somebody decides to...
They are remaking it, by the way.
Oh, why would you say that?
I'm so sorry, Kelly. Also, Jason Blum is remaking it and Brian Fuller is directing.
I hate this news.
I'm so sorry.
Why would you say that? It will come true then. Christine being remade now, it's going to like absolutely bludgeon us with these political implications. So they move beyond subtext to this place where it's just like impossible, or not impossible, but it just makes the film, I feel like it just really undermines what is so wonderful about this genre.
Well, I think what's really interesting as you were talking is like not only the music cues and the city of Detroit, but the fact that we start in a car factory as well, which is a very like, it's basically the I don't know what the right word for it is. It's basically the point where kind of this affluent Americana culture that became kind of a symbol of American culture in the 1950s, especially through American films, this boom, kind of all of that capitalistic society and the image of the car as a status symbol and as a necessary or almost another person in a nuclear family kind of was created. So it's kind of the birth of Americana in many ways that we're seeing. And at the same time, all those music cues, and I'm looking at the list of songs that are included in the film now. All of those things, the picking of the original rock and rollers that we are now, now everyone culturally acknowledges that, yes, absolutely, rock and roll was invented by Black musicians, Black American musicians specifically. So, but there was, especially in the 80s, when I'm thinking of hair rock, I'm thinking of glam, I'm thinking of metal, a lot of these things that create an image of rockers as being incredibly overly sexualized, kind of glammy white dudes with long hair. That is not where rock and roll kind of comes from. Definitely not musically. But all of those things are incredibly subtle. You kind of have to know or recognize the music of Little Richard. You kind of have to recognize what he did, kind of have to in a way recognize the riffs or recognize some of the influences at least. And all music kind of is woven in together. Their musicians are constantly ripping each other off, like in little bits and pieces. It's not something that's happening now with Olivia Rodrigo. Like that has always happened. But
Courtney. Let me not invoke that. Revoke the ire of Courtney Love.
I just want to say the best possible reaction to that all of those controversies has been my favorite Elvis Costello, who's been like, "Are you joking? I don't give a shit. Like everybody does this. I used to do this. Like, have you listened to my early shit? Like that's all ripoffs."
I love that he said that.
Yeah, good for him. He's like, dude, I've had my time. Let her do her thing. Like, good for her.
Good for you, Elvis Costello. I'm sorry, I am a dad.
But I do kind of, to go back to your point, kind of, I love the fact that that is there. And that is a layer that perhaps is much more evident, I think, to American viewers, like people who are much more steamed in kind of in American culture and in Americana, and then another layer for like music lovers or rock and roll lovers who will know the history of the musicians that are playing. But also those musical choices kind of instantly evoke a 1950s vibe. So we know we're already being displaced in time because we're in the 70s and the music choices are not from the 70s. And they also sound like something that is nostalgic towards the 50s. So it's very much kind of like a Grease approach to horror, where like these are 70s people, but they're thinking and kind of like having all these cultural markers of being in the 50s, except in Christine, it's just Arnie. Arnie is the only one who's kind of trying to role play Danny Zuko here. No one else is in on the joke with him.
But I think also it sort of is like those eras are deeply connected, right? Because we talked about what was happening in the 70s, but also in the 50s, you have the dawn of the Cold War and you have the Civil Rights Movement. So these things are so cyclical. Is that right? Cyclical. They continue to they continue to reappear, right? And I think that's deeply linked to the way that Christine herself, much more reasonably than say Michael Myers, does continue to sort of reanimate, because the truth is that those eras are very deeply linked. We're talking about baby boomers here. And this is their generation, and I think they're actually like very deeply all of the horrors that are happening in the 70s have a kind of almost direct mirror into what's happening what's happening in the 50s. So they do kind of double each other. I do think that's like such an interesting and really quite generational link to make, because even though Arnie is really the villain of this piece, like you're saying, it is also very true that like what's happening is that within Christine and Arnie are collapsing all of these like really grotesque social horrors. Like, there is something like incredibly noxious about Christine that's obviously supernatural, but it's also quite like all wrapped up and bound up in what she embodies and ultimately what Arnie then embodies. So it is kind of a sort of like, one horror begets more horrors, and it sort of continues in that way. And so the last scene where she's sort of twitching and getting ready to sort of rebuild herself makes sense, because now we've moved past the 70s and we're still in this situation in which, we continue to be haunted by troubling conceptions of gender and masculinity and racism. And so these things have yet to die. And so I think that's like, actually, Christine is probably one of the more chilling, to me, in my view, one of the more chilling horror films. And also I think because, like you were saying, like there is really no explanation for where her evil comes from as far as the film is concerned. So it is completely mappable, right? So much of it comes from what we perceive from her. But yeah.
And really just start kind of wrapping up a conversation around Christine. What do you make of that, of the way that the film ends? Arnie dies. We're not able to save him. Christine gets, I'm sure there's a proper car word for it. I don't drive. I don't know. I'm European. Like, there's no one fucking drives here. Like, why would I ever need a license? Like, there's undergrounds and metros
drive
everywhere. Of course you drive,
and
you're American.
But I'm saying I don't know the words either. Like I would be able, she's compressed, right? Like she's in a junkyard.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
She's made into
a little tiny thing.
A little tiny compressed Christine, let's call her that.
Yeah.
And kind of, we do get our little Carrie moment at the end of the film, which I really liked, where, she twitches, one of the tubes twitches a little bit, which is just like Carrie's hand popping out from her grave in the fake out ending of Carrie. But what do you think overall of the way that the film ends? and how it leaves us.
I mean, I think it's sort of all the things that we've been saying, right? Like, it is not Christine's just not gonna die easily, because the things that she represents will not die easily. But I also think it's like quite an interesting setup, right? That is quite distinct from a lot of teen horror films, and so I'd be interested to hear what you think. And that Dennis also survives, even though he's not useless, but like Dennis is not great. I mean, he's like he's kind of like he is like Arnie, right? And I mean, perhaps this is the point. I mean, I'm almost certain this is the point, like, right? Like, Arnie dies, but Dennis too sort of still carries a lot of these, although I suppose we see him sort of like be really tender with Lee, but it's easy for him to be tender with Lee because he's attracted to Lee and he wanted her from the beginning. We really haven't actually seen any redemption for Dennis either. So it is an interesting thing where it's like, typically in these teen horror films, the thing that sort of gets or allows the one woman to survive is that she's virginal, but she also kind of embodies certain masculine tendencies that allow for, or as I think Carol Clover has famously argued, a generally teen male audience to also identify with her. She is not, alienatingly female. And that is true of Lee, because Lee wears, like, I don't know what those pants are called, but they're kind of like, they're like long shorts, capris, and she herself kind of looks like a 1950s boy, or dresses like one. And so maybe that's what that other guy was alluding to. But it's interesting that these are the characters who survive, as well as Harry Dean Stanton, although, like I said, like, he's kind of on the sidelines, not really contributing anything, certainly not solving this case. But what do you make of it? I'd be interested to hear.
I mean, I loved Harry Dean Stanton's contribution, which I actually wrote down, where he was like, you know what, some things can be helped, some people too. I'm like, okay. That tracks. That summarizes the entire film. Thank you, Harry Dean. With that sentiment, in a way, it was like Arnie was always going to end badly, whether Christine appeared in his life or not. I think Christine just expedited his terrible ending. But that's the way that I read it. And I thought it really interesting, kind of looking at all of these horror films. And I'm really containing myself and not looking at films kind of ahead of the schedule, because I'm going quite chronologically, is that the teen protagonists that we have are usually dictated by kind of expectations of who's the good teenager, who's the bad teenager. And here they're all kind of terrible. But I think that I think that Dennis does kind of learn. He learns because he sees what's going on with Arnie. I think Lee is kind of objectified in this film, both in a sexual way and kind of in a narrative way. I don't think she really contributes that much. She kind of tries to do good, but she doesn't really get enough space to develop a personality of her own. It's always just by association with the boys who want to fuck her, basically. And what I did really love was kind of how Arnie transformed into a villain and then got punished. Like, he had to die because he is the villain. He is the villain of his own movie. And I love that the movie doesn't excuse him. He's terrible. His friends do try to save him, but I think that's more because that's kind of what's expected of them. It's not because they actually want to. And I think this like twitch by Christine, the fact that Christine never really fully dies, makes complete sense with the fact that we never really kind of see an explanation for why Christine is evil, like we've been discussing. And in many ways, this feels like very much exactly like the blueprint for the teen horrors that would come afterwards, or the franchising of teen horrors. But I don't think this ever really got franchised, because if it did, it would just become like a silly, oh, this car is going to murder me thing. And eventually, Christine would start talking with the voice of Bruce Willis or something like that. And it isn't. It's so much.
I mean, don't say that when the film's being remade. They're gagging for ideas like this. So
I know, but
I
think they're gonna make it a lot more sexual, to be honest. I think that's what's gonna happen. I know Brian Fuller's work, and I know the way that Titan has been like reacted to. So like Christine's gonna fuck in 2022 when she gets remade or whatever.
I love Brian Fuller.
Yeah, so the car's gonna fuck. That's what's gonna happen.
Oh, I hope not. Maybe she'll be queer. That would be great.
Maybe. But to get back to your point, I think actually it kind of sets up the open door for this being more, but I'm really glad that nothing else happened, because I think the story that we needed to see was the story of Arnie's disintegration. That's the story. It's not the story of an evil car. And I think that kind of and it's chilling because we're not used to seeing the nerd as the source of evil yet at this point in 1983. So I think in that way, it's really it's quite different in a way, because we get to see a lot of this, like, oh, it's actually the teenagers who are evil because one of them is the killer, whatever. We see that a lot in the 90s later on in the slasher, in the renaissance of the slasher in the 90s. But this early on, I think it is really eerie. And I think Keith Gordon's performance specifically, and the way that he is physically, his physicality plays a lot into this, because he looks like a perfectly nice all-American boy, but he is a very, very scary personality. And I find that quite chilling in a very modern way, seeing this film now. So actually, I think this is a kind of a surreptitious teen horror film where the things that are scary and not the things that are the movies telling us that are scary, if that makes sense. I don't know if you're cutting out or if you're just dissatisfied with my answer, Kelly.
Yeah, I'm satisfied with this answer. I'm satisfied with this conclusion.
Is there anything that you wanted to mention about Christine that we haven't managed to cover in our conversation?
I don't think so. The only thing that I will say as an outro is that I, eagerly anticipate the I Know What You Did Last Summer episode. It will be many episodes in the future, I imagine, because you haven't gotten to the 90s yet. But that is my comfort movie. It makes me feel good when I'm low. And I love teen horror. So this is a great series. I'm happy to be part of it in any small way.
So, Kelly, for anyone who's not familiar with your work, where can people find more of your work online?
I suppose you can find me at Sight and Sound. You can find me at Reverse Shot. I write for them and numerous other publications, and I'm on Twitter as Kelly with an I, Weston.
Excellent. Thank you so much, as always, for your time and for your insight on the Killer Car movie, which turned out to be the Killer Insult movie.
I mean, a banger. I highly recommend it.